A single drone intercepted in the skies above the United Arab Emirates dropped burning debris onto one of the most strategically critical energy facilities on Earth. Within minutes, fire broke out at Fujairah port, the UAE's only crude oil export terminal that operates outside the Strait of Hormuz. Loading operations halted immediately. Tankers sat motionless offshore. And global oil markets, already strained to their limits by weeks of escalating warfare between the United States, Israel, and Iran, absorbed yet another violent shock. Brent crude closed above $100 a barrel for the second consecutive day. But what makes this particular incident far more consequential than the fire it caused is what it exposed. A strategic vulnerability so deep that it could reshape the entire calculus of the war unfolding across the Persian Gulf. The date was March 14th, 2026. Exactly one day after U.S. Central Command carried out massive airstrikes on Iran's Karg Island, destroying more than 90 military targets on the small coral outcrop that handles roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. Those American strikes deliberately spared Karg's oil infrastructure, a calculated act of restraint designed to preserve coercive leverage over Tehran. But Iran's response came swiftly, and it wasn't aimed at another military installation. It targeted the economic infrastructure of a U.S. partner state, specifically the single most important backup artery in the Gulf's entire oil export system. And the reason that choice matters so much requires understanding the geography that controls how oil moves out of the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, carries roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil every single day. That represents approximately 25% of all seaborne oil trade on the planet. Every major Gulf producer, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, funnels the overwhelming majority of its exports through this one corridor. For decades, energy strategists and military planners have identified Hormuz as the greatest concentration of supply chain risk anywhere in the global energy system. Wars have been fought near it. Tankers have been attacked in it. Contingency plans have been drawn up around it. And right now, with Iran actively deploying mines, armed drones, and coastal anti-ship missiles to enforce a blockade, the scenario that all of those plans were written for has arrived. Fujairah was built to be the emergency exit. Located on the Gulf of Oman along the UAE's eastern coastline, the port sits physically outside the Strait of Hormuz. It connects to Abu Dhabi's onshore oil fields through a 400-kilometer pipeline known as ADCOP, the Abu Dhabi Crude Oil Pipeline. This infrastructure exists for precisely this kind of crisis, a situation in which the strait becomes impassable and an alternative route must carry the load. The pipeline's capacity has been reported at close to 1.8 million barrels per day, though the UAE typically pushes around 1.1 million barrels daily through the system under normal operating conditions. That leaves approximately 700,000 barrels per day of spare capacity, a margin that in today's wartime environment has transformed from a routine logistical buffer into an economic lifeline for an entire nation. But Fujairah is far more than a pipeline terminus. It operates as one of the Middle East's most essential bunkering and storage hubs, a logistics node that serves vessels and traders operating across the Indian Ocean and beyond. Over the past year, the port handled an average of 1.7 million barrels per day of crude oil and refined fuels combined, roughly 1.7% of total daily world oil demand flowing through a single facility. Fujairah hosts the largest commercial storage capacity for refined petroleum products anywhere in the region, and the overwhelming majority of its exports flow eastward toward Asia, toward China, India, Japan, and South Korea. When the Strait of Hormuz functions normally, Fujairah is a valuable piece of Gulf energy infrastructure. When Hormuz is under threat, Fujairah becomes irreplaceable. And on March 14th, that irreplaceable facility was hit. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had signaled its intentions openly. In the hours following the Karg Island bombardment, the IRGC declared that American interests across the UAE, including ports and docks, were legitimate military targets. Iranian state media escalated the rhetoric further, broadcasting public warnings to civilians living near Jebel Ali port in Dubai, Khalifa port in Abu Dhabi, and Fujairah, urging residents to evacuate the surrounding areas. There was no ambiguity in the message. Iran intended to make the UAE bear a tangible cost for its strategic proximity to Washington's war effort, and the tool of choice was the credible threat of infrastructure destruction. The drone that reached Fujairah's airspace was intercepted. It never struck the facility directly. But falling debris from the shootdown ignited a fire that forced an immediate halt to all oil loading operations. Port emergency teams and local authorities responded rapidly, bringing the blaze under control within hours. By early Sunday morning, March 15th, industry sources confirmed that tankers had begun docking again and crude loading had restarted. The total disruption lasted approximately 12 hours. Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, ADNOC, did not immediately issue a formal public statement, and some uncertainty remained about whether operations had fully returned to normal throughput during those initial hours. But the speed of recovery was, by the standards of wartime infrastructure management, genuinely notable. 12 hours of downtime. On the surface, that reads like a success story, evidence that Fujairah's emergency protocols work, that the facility can absorb a blow and resume operations before most of the world finishes its weekend. And from a purely operational standpoint, that assessment is fair. But the reassurance dissolves the moment you step back and examine the broader strategic arithmetic. Because the numbers behind the Gulf's bypass infrastructure reveal a vulnerability of staggering scale. And this is where the real weight of this story sits. Not in what happened during those 12 hours, but in what happens if the next attack is worse. If this is reshaping how you understand the Gulf's energy architecture and what it means for oil prices going forward, share your perspective in the comments. The strategic questions raised here don't have easy answers, and the debate matters. Consider the total bypass capacity available if the Strait of Hormuz were fully and permanently closed. The UAE's ADCOP pipeline offers roughly 700,000 barrels per day of additional throughput beyond current usage. Saudi Arabia maintains the East-West pipeline, which connects the kingdom's eastern oil fields to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, with a nameplate capacity that has been expanded to approximately 7 million barrels per day. Current utilization sits around 4.3 million barrels daily, leaving somewhere between 700,000 and 1.9 million barrels per day of spare Saudi capacity, depending on how quickly volumes can be rerouted and operational constraints managed. Add both systems together, and the U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates that about 2.6 million barrels per day of combined spare bypass capacity exists between the two pipeline networks. That's the total. Against the nearly 20 million barrels per day that normally transit Hormuz, that leaves a shortfall exceeding 17 million barrels daily. A gap so vast that no combination of existing infrastructure anywhere on Earth can close it. Iran also constructed a pipeline, the Gora-Jask route, intended to carry its own crude to a port outside the strait, but the line remains non-operational. The bypass routes that actually function today cover barely 13% of what would be lost in a full Hormuz shutdown. This is the reality that global oil markets are now pricing, and it explains the ferocity of the price response. Brent crude has surged more than 40% since the broader conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran escalated into open warfare. The conflict has already removed over 7 million barrels per day of Middle Eastern production from global supply, approximately 7% of the world total. The International Energy Agency responded with its largest ever coordinated intervention, authorizing the release of 400 million barrels from strategic petroleum reserves across member nations, with Japan alone contributing 80 million barrels. Reserve releases of that magnitude can smooth short-term price shocks, calm market panic, and buy time for logistics networks to adjust. What they cannot do is replace the continuous daily flow of crude that the global economy requires to function over weeks and months. Strategic reserves are a finite cushion, not a permanent substitute for uninterrupted production. The threat extends well beyond crude oil. A sustained closure of the Strait of Hormuz would also strand approximately 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas exports. Qatar, one of the largest LNG exporters on the planet, ships virtually all of its cargoes through the strait. So does the UAE. Unlike crude, LNG has no alternative pipeline routes. Every cubic meter must travel by specialized tanker through the same choke point. For Asian economies that have structured their energy supply strategies around long-term Gulf LNG contracts, a prolonged blockade wouldn't merely raise costs. It would create physical shortages with no rapid workaround, no alternative supplier able to fill the gap on short notice, and severe downstream consequences for power generation, industrial production, and heating. The countries standing most directly in the path of this disruption are the ones receiving the largest share of Gulf energy flows. EIA data indicates that roughly 69% of the crude oil transiting the Strait of Hormuz is bound for Asian markets, principally China, India, Japan, and South Korea. These economies collectively drive enormous shares of global manufacturing, electronics production, automotive output, and food processing. When energy costs spike at this magnitude, the damage doesn't remain confined to fuel bills. It radiates outward through every supply chain those economies feed: transportation costs, factory inputs, agricultural production, consumer goods pricing. Inflationary pressures that had been gradually receding across many economies through late 2025 are now accelerating again, forcing central banks from the Federal Reserve to the Bank of Japan to recalculate their monetary policy trajectories in real time. All of it traces back, in part, to a single facility on the Gulf of Oman that came under attack and recovered in half a day. The speed of Fujairah's operational rebound matters. The structural fragility it represents matters considerably more. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. The way this military conflict intersects with energy infrastructure and the global economy is going to remain one of the most consequential stories through the rest of 2026. And the situation is moving fast. What the Fujairah attack demonstrated, more starkly than perhaps any other single event in this war, is the critical difference between operational resilience and structural invulnerability. The port proved it can absorb a strike and recover. 12 hours of downtime, contained damage, a swift restart. That is a strong performance under wartime conditions. But resilience at one facility does not resolve the fundamental weakness of an entire region's export architecture. Fujairah can survive a drone. It might survive a series of them. The question that markets, governments, and military planners are now confronting is whether the port can continue to function as the Gulf's primary Hormuz bypass under sustained, repeated, and escalating attack. Because Iran has stated explicitly and publicly that it considers the facility a legitimate target, and the IRGC has demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to follow through. The strategic picture darkens further when you examine what Iran specifically gains by targeting Fujairah. Every other major Gulf producer depends on the Strait of Hormuz for its exports. When Iran blocks the strait, those producers suffer alongside Tehran. Shared economic pain that, in a grim sense, distributes the consequences broadly. But Fujairah represents the UAE's escape hatch, the one pathway that allows Abu Dhabi to continue selling crude even when Hormuz is sealed shut. By threatening Fujairah, Iran sends a signal that reaches far beyond the Emirates. No Gulf state is permitted to insulate itself from the economic damage of this conflict. That warning is directed at every regional capital, weighing whether to support the American military campaign, remain neutral, or quietly seek to benefit from the upheaval. For companies operating across the Gulf, the consequences are immediate and tangible. Maritime insurance premiums for vessels calling at regional ports have spiked dramatically. Evacuation protocols are being activated at commercial and industrial facilities throughout the UAE and neighboring states. Energy traders are working urgently to secure alternative storage capacity outside the conflict zone, attempting to reduce the concentration risk that arises when critical logistics infrastructure clusters around a small number of vulnerable points. Supply chain managers across sectors well beyond energy, manufacturing, consumer goods, food distribution, electronics, are conducting rapid reassessments of their exposure to Gulf shipping corridors, even as the practical alternatives remain limited, costly, and logistically complex. At the policy level, regional governments face mounting pressure to invest in expanding bypass infrastructure, additional pipeline routes, new port facilities, geographically dispersed storage networks that could reduce dependence on Hormuz over the medium to long term. But infrastructure at that scale requires years of planning, financing, and construction. The crisis is happening now. In the near term, governments must build fiscal buffers against the possibility that sustained conflict forces Gulf producers to shut in additional production volumes, directly threatening the economic stability of nations whose entire budget structures rest on petroleum revenue. For institutional investors and asset managers, the stability of facilities like Fujairah can no longer sit as a background assumption in valuation models. It is now an active, material variable affecting sovereign credit profiles and the risk calculus for Gulf energy assets broadly. If someone you know needs to understand why energy prices are climbing, why shipping costs are spiking, and what is actually driving the instability rippling through global markets right now, send this to them. What happened at Fujairah has consequences that reach directly to the prices all of us pay. The drone intercepted over Fujairah on March 14th didn't destroy anything irreplaceable. The fire was extinguished. The tankers came back. Oil started flowing again before most of the world registered what had happened. By the narrow metric of infrastructure survival, the system worked. But that system is being tested under sustained pressure it was never designed to absorb indefinitely. The bypass capacity that exists represents a fraction of what a full Hormuz closure would demand. The threats against the facility are explicit, credible, and backed by demonstrated military reach. And the broader conflict that generated this attack, the strikes on Karg Island, Iran's blockade of the Strait, the paralyzed diplomacy, the absent ceasefire, offers no visible path toward de-escalation. What Fujairah's 12-hour shutdown ultimately revealed is not that the Gulf's energy backbone can withstand punishment. It's that the margin between a disruption the world can manage and one it cannot is far thinner than anyone had comfortably assumed. And with each passing day of this war, that margin narrows.